5,400 meters down in the South Pacific, deeper than the Titanic, cameras capture something that defies every law of naval warfare. The USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier that took 9 torpedoes and over 400 bomb hits, sitting almost intact on the ocean floor. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This ship didn't just sink quietly after being overwhelmed. She was attacked for 8 hours straight by the entire Japanese Naval Air Force. And even after they gave up and sailed away, she still wouldn't go down. The Americans had to sink their own ship because the Japanese couldn't finish the job. October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz. The Hornet launches her aircraft toward the Japanese fleet. And minutes later, the entire sky fills with enemy planes coming the other way. What happens next would become the most brutal carrier versus carrier slugfest of World War II. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, even pilots crashing their damaged aircraft directly into the ship in proto-kamikaze attacks. For 8 hours, the Japanese throw everything they have at the Hornet, trying to erase the carrier that had humiliated them 6 months earlier by bombing Tokyo itself. But the Hornet refuses to die. Wave after wave of attacks. Explosions that would sink any other ship, fires that consume entire sections, flooding that should capsize her, and she just keeps floating. The Japanese finally give up and leave, certain she'll sink on her own. She doesn't. The Americans try to scuttle her with torpedoes from their own destroyers. She still floats. They fire over 400 rounds of 5-inch shells into her at point-blank range. She's still there. And only when Japanese destroyers return and hit her with 4 more torpedoes does the Hornet finally slip beneath the waves. 77 years later, in February 2019, billionaire Paul Allen's expedition finds her, and what they discover, sitting in the crushing darkness of the South Pacific, isn't just a shipwreck. It's evidence of the most stubborn, most resilient, most impossibly tough aircraft carrier ever built. A ship that bombed the Japanese homeland when everyone said it was impossible. A ship that helped win Midway. A ship that took damage that would have sunk 3 normal carriers and still wouldn't give up. This is the story of the USS Hornet. The ship that refused to die even when dying was the only logical option left. The USS Hornet wasn't supposed to be famous. She was laid down on September 25, 1939, at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, just another Yorktown-class aircraft carrier in a fleet that was desperately trying to catch up to Japanese naval aviation. When she was commissioned on October 20, 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, nobody imagined this ship would be carrying out the most audacious air raid in American military history within 6 months. The Hornet was 809 feet long, displaced 25,500 tons when fully loaded, and could carry up to 90 aircraft. Her flight deck was 3 acres of wood planking over steel, and she could launch planes faster than any carrier in the world. But speed and capacity meant nothing if you didn't have a mission. And in early 1942, after Pearl Harbor, after the Philippines fell, after Singapore surrendered, and the Japanese seemed unstoppable, the United States Navy was desperate for any mission that could strike back. President Roosevelt wanted to bomb Japan, not just attack their forward positions, not raid their bases in the Pacific, actually bomb the Japanese home islands to prove that America could hit back, that the attack on Pearl Harbor hadn't broken American resolve. The problem was simple. No carrier-based aircraft had the range to reach Japan and return. Launching a raid meant sending pilots on a one-way mission. And even that seemed impossible, because carriers couldn't get close enough to Japan without being detected and destroyed. But there was one possibility. One insane, mathematically improbable idea that just might work. Army Air Force B-25 bombers had the range to reach Japan from 400 miles away. They were land-based medium bombers, never designed to operate from carriers. They were too big, too heavy, and required runways far longer than a carrier deck. But Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle did the math and realized something. If you stripped the planes down, loaded them at the absolute rear of the flight deck, and gave the pilots just enough training to take off in 400 feet instead of the normal 1,200, you might be able to launch them from a carrier. You couldn't land them back on the carrier. The pilots would have to ditch in China and hope the Chinese could help them escape to safety. But you could launch them. Maybe, if everything went perfectly, if the carrier wasn't detected, if the weather cooperated, if the pilots didn't crash during takeoff and block the deck, if 1,000 things didn't go wrong. The Navy chose the Hornet for the mission because she was new, fast, and her crew hadn't been bloodied yet by the disasters of early 1942. On April 2, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were loaded onto her flight deck in San Francisco. The carrier looked absurd, her deck crammed with Army bombers, no room for her own aircraft, basically a floating runway, with no way to defend herself if attacked. The crew wasn't told where they were going, or what the mission was. They just knew it was important enough to risk the Navy's newest carrier on something that had never been attempted before. April 18, 1942. The Hornet is 650 nautical miles from Japan, further than planned because Japanese patrol boats had been spotted. Doolittle makes the call: launch now, or abort the mission. The seas are rough. The carrier is pitching in heavy swells. The B-25s have to take off from a deck that's rising and falling unpredictably. This is the moment where everything could go catastrophically wrong. Doolittle's bomber is first. The deck crew positions it as far back as possible. The engines roar. The carrier turns into the wind and increases speed to maximum, giving the plane every possible advantage. Doolittle releases the brakes. The B-25 accelerates down the deck, all 31,000 pounds of bomber and fuel racing toward the bow. It reaches the edge and drops. For a moment it disappears below the level of the flight deck. Every man watching thinks it's crashed into the ocean. Then the plane claws its way back up into the air, gaining altitude, engines straining. It worked. 15 more bombers follow. Every single one makes it off the deck. All 16 aircraft fly toward Japan, and several hours later they drop their bombs on Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. The physical damage is minimal, but the psychological impact is massive. The Japanese homeland has been attacked. The American carriers that everyone thought were cowering in Pearl Harbor have struck the heart of the empire, and the Japanese military is humiliated. The Hornet returns to Pearl Harbor, a hero. But the crew knows something that the newspapers celebrating the raid don't report. The carrier herself never launched a single one of her own aircraft during the operation. She was defenseless the entire time. If Japanese carriers had found her, the Hornet would have been sunk before she could fight back. The Doolittle Raid succeeded, but it succeeded because the Hornet got lucky. Luck runs out. And for the Hornet, it would run out at the Battle of Midway. June 4, 1942. The Hornet is part of Task Force 16, supporting the American ambush of the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway Island. This is the battle that will determine control of the Pacific. The Japanese are bringing 4 fleet carriers. The Americans have 3, and everything depends on whose aircraft find the enemy first. The Hornet launches her strike group at dawn. Torpedo Squadron 8. Dive bombers, fighters, all heading toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. But there's a problem. The Japanese have changed course. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying slow and low, finds the enemy fleet anyway and attacks without fighter escort. All 15 aircraft are shot down. Only 1 pilot survives. It's a massacre. The Hornet's dive bombers never find the target. They fly the wrong heading and end up searching empty ocean while the battle rages elsewhere. By the time they realize their mistake and turn back, their fuel is critically low. Some ditch in the ocean. Others barely make it back to the carrier. It's a navigation disaster that costs aircraft and lives. But while the Hornet's strike group is scattered and lost, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown find the Japanese carriers and destroy 3 of them in 6 minutes. Midway is an American victory, one of the most decisive naval battles in history, and the Hornet's contribution is basically zero. Her torpedo squadron was slaughtered. Her dive bombers got lost. She was present for the most important carrier battle of the war, and she accomplished almost nothing. The crew knows it. The other carriers know it. There's no official blame, but there's an understanding that the Hornet got lucky again. She was there when history was made, but she didn't make the history herself. And some officers wonder if this carrier is cursed, if she's destined to be present for great events, but never quite deliver when it matters most. 4 months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Hornet would get her chance to prove them wrong, or die trying. October 26, 1942. The Solomon Islands. The Hornet and Enterprise are the only two operational American carriers left in the Pacific. The Lexington was sunk at Coral Sea. The Yorktown went down at Midway. The Saratoga and Wasp were torpedoed by submarines. Every other carrier is under repair or still being built. If the Japanese can sink these two carriers, they'll have naval superiority for months, maybe longer. The Japanese know this. They're bringing everything they can. The carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Suihaku, Zuihaku, 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 the 200 aircraft. This isn't a raid or a skirmish. This is the Japanese Navy's attempt to destroy the American carrier force once and for all. The Hornet launches her strike at 7:30 a.m. 15 dive bombers, 6 torpedo bombers, 8 fighters. They're going after the Japanese carriers. It's the same mission as Midway. Find the enemy flat tops and sink them before they can launch their own strikes. This time the Hornet's aircraft don't get lost. They find the Shokaku and hit her hard. 2 bombs penetrate the flight deck, starting fires and putting the carrier out of action. It's the kind of successful strike the Hornet has been trying to achieve since Midway. But while the American aircraft are attacking the Japanese fleet, the Japanese aircraft are attacking the American fleet, and the Hornet, having just launched her planes, has a nearly empty flight deck. She's vulnerable in exactly the way carriers are most afraid of being vulnerable. No aircraft in the air to intercept, no time to launch more, just the ship, her anti-aircraft guns, and whatever fighters the Enterprise can spare. At 9:12 a.m., radar picks up the incoming raid, over 60 Japanese aircraft, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, heading straight for the American carriers. The Hornet begins maneuvering, trying to make herself a harder target. Her anti-aircraft guns open fire. The sky fills with flak, and the Japanese come in anyway. The first wave hits like a sledgehammer. Dive bombers screaming down from 10,000 feet. Torpedo bombers skimming the waves. Fighters strafing the deck. The Hornet's captain, Charles Mason, is throwing the ship into hard turns, trying to dodge torpedoes while the AA guns fire at maximum rate. It's chaos. Explosions. Aircraft crashing into the sea. Some shot down by AA fire. Others hit by fighters from the Enterprise. But there are too many attackers and not enough defenders. At 9:14 a.m., 3 bombs hit in rapid succession. One penetrates the flight deck near the island and explodes in the hangar deck below. Fuel lines rupture. Aircraft catch fire. The hangar becomes an inferno. Another bomb hits the flight deck and detonates on impact, killing the gun crews nearby. The third bomb punches through multiple decks before exploding in the ship's interior, starting fires in spaces that are almost impossible to reach. Then the torpedoes arrive. 2 Type 91 torpedoes, the same type that sank battleships at Pearl Harbor, slam into the Hornet's starboard side. The explosions tear massive holes in the hull below the waterline. The engine rooms flood. The ship loses power. She's dead in the water, burning with no electricity to run pumps or fire suppression systems. But the Japanese aren't done. A damaged dive bomber, unable to pull out of its attack run, crashes directly into the Hornet's island structure. The impact and explosion kill most of the bridge crew. The ship's command center is destroyed. Captain Mason survives but is wounded. Command authority shifts to officers scattered throughout the ship, who can barely communicate because internal communications are destroyed. Another damaged aircraft crashes into the flight deck near the number 1 elevator. More fires. More casualties. And through all of this, the Hornet's crew is fighting back. Damage control teams are battling fires. Medics are treating hundreds of wounded. Officers are trying to organize a response, despite having no centralized command. And the anti-aircraft guns that can still fire keep shooting at every Japanese plane in range. By 9:30 a.m., just 18 minutes after the attack began, the Hornet is a floating wreck. She's listing, burning in multiple locations, without power, without propulsion, and her steering is jammed. The Japanese aircraft break off and head back to their carriers. They're certain the Hornet is finished. They've never seen a carrier take this much damage and survive. But the Hornet is still floating, and her crew hasn't given up. For the next 4 hours, the crew fights to save their ship. Portable pumps are dragged through smoke-filled passages to fight flooding. Hoses are unreeled to battle fires in the hangar deck. Wounded are carried to what's left of the sick bay. The destroyers Mustin and Anderson pull alongside to provide firefighting support and evacuate casualties. The fleet tug Vireo arrives and begins trying to tow the Hornet out of the combat zone. It's working. Slowly. The fires are being contained. The flooding is controlled enough that the list isn't getting worse. If they can just get the Hornet far enough away from the battle, if they can buy enough time for repairs, she might survive. She might make it back to Pearl Harbor. She might fight again. At 3:20 p.m., radar picks up another incoming raid. The Japanese haven't given up. They're coming back to finish what they started. 50 more aircraft, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The Hornet is still dead in the water. The Vireo's tow is too slow to evade. And this time, there's no fighter cover, because the Enterprise has her own problems and can't spare aircraft. The second attack is methodical. The Japanese have learned from the morning. They know the Hornet can't maneuver. They line up their attacks carefully. At 3:42 p.m., a torpedo hits the starboard side. At 3:43 p.m., another torpedo hits. The Hornet lurches. Water pours into the engineering spaces that had just been pumped dry. The list increases to 14 degrees. Then a dive bomber scores a direct hit on the flight deck. The bomb penetrates into the ship's interior and explodes near what's left of the operational damage control center. The men who've been coordinating the save the ship effort are killed or scattered. Organization breaks down. Different sections of the ship are fighting their own battles without coordination. At 4:15 p.m., Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding the task force, makes the hardest decision of his career. The Hornet can't be saved. She can't be towed. Japanese surface forces are approaching and will be in range within hours. If the Americans stay to keep fighting for the Hornet, they'll lose the destroyers too. The order is given. Abandon ship. The crew begins evacuating. Men slide down ropes into boats from the destroyers. The wounded are lowered in stretchers. Some jump directly into the ocean to be picked up. It's an organized evacuation, not a panicked rout. The Hornet's crew has fought for 7 hours to save their ship, and even now they're not running. They're leaving because they've been ordered to leave. By 5 p.m., the last men are off the Hornet. The destroyers Mustin and Anderson receive the order nobody wants: sink the Hornet. They can't let the Japanese capture an American carrier. They can't let her be towed back to Japan as a prize. She has to go down, and she has to go down now, before the enemy surface forces arrive. The two destroyers open fire with every gun they have. 5-inch shells at point-blank range. Over 400 rounds pumped into the Hornet's hull. It's like executing a wounded animal. Every hit is visible. Explosions. More fires. The ship taking damage that would have sunk her hours ago if she were any normal carrier. But the Hornet just won't go down. The destroyers launch torpedoes. 6 Mark 15 torpedoes. The most powerful weapons the destroyers have. Massive underwater explosions. The Hornet shudders with each hit. She lists further. She's lower in the water, but she's still floating. It's getting dark. Japanese surface forces are close enough that staying any longer means risking the destroyers. The American ships have fired everything they have at the Hornet. Over 400 shells, 6 torpedoes, 8 hours of battle damage from Japanese aircraft. And she's still afloat, burning in the darkness, refusing to die. The destroyers retreat. They have no choice. They report that the Hornet is certainly going to sink, that there's no way she can survive the night. But as they disappear over the horizon, the Hornet is still there, still floating, still burning. A ghost ship that won't accept that she's dead. At 11:20 p.m., Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo find the Hornet. They can't believe what they're seeing. An American carrier, dead in the water, burning, clearly abandoned. The ultimate prize. They consider trying to tow her back to Japan. Can you imagine? The carrier that bombed Tokyo, captured and paraded through Japanese ports. The propaganda victory would be immense. But the Hornet is too badly damaged. She's too low in the water. Towing her is impossible. So, the Japanese destroyers do what the American destroyers couldn't finish. They launch 4 Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, the most powerful naval torpedoes in the world. All 4 hit. Massive explosions tear through what's left of the Hornet's hull. The structural integrity that had kept her afloat through 9 torpedoes and over 400 shells finally gives way. At 1:35 a.m. on October 27, 1942, the USS Hornet finally rolls onto her side and sinks. She went down bow first, her stern lifting out of the water one last time before she slipped beneath the surface. From the first bomb hit to final sinking, she fought for over 16 hours. She took more damage than any carrier in naval history and still required 4 additional torpedoes from the enemy to finish her off. The Japanese destroyers reported back to their fleet command with something close to disbelief. The Hornet had taken 9 torpedoes total, over 400 5-inch shells, dozens of bomb hits, 2 aircraft crashes, and she floated until the very end. Japanese officers studying the battle reports later admitted they'd never seen anything like it. American engineering and damage control had created something that seemed unsinkable. But sink, she did. Taking with her 140 men, killed in action, and the legend of the carrier that bombed Tokyo. The Hornet earned 4 battle stars for her service. She participated in 2 of the most important naval battles of the Pacific War. She launched the most audacious air raid in American history. And when she died hard, refusing to go quietly, making the enemy work for every minute it took to send her to the bottom. For 77 years, the Hornet rested in the darkness of the South Pacific, 5,400 meters down, deeper than most shipwrecks, in a part of the ocean floor that remained unexplored, simply because the technology to reach those depths didn't exist. The survivors grew old, the Battle of Santa Cruz faded from popular memory, and the exact location where the Hornet went down remained uncertain. Then came Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, who'd made finding lost World War II ships his personal mission. In 2015, his team found the Japanese battleship Musashi. In 2017, they found the USS Indianapolis. In 2018, they found the USS Lexington. Allen was systematic, methodical, and willing to spend whatever it took to bring these stories back from the deep. The Hornet was always on his list. But finding her would be extraordinarily difficult. The coordinates of her sinking were approximate. The depth was extreme, beyond what most underwater search vehicles could handle. And the South Pacific has strong currents that could have moved debris over decades. Most experts thought the Hornet would never be found. Or if she was found, she'd be in such deep water that documenting the wreck would be nearly impossible. February 2019. The research vessel, RV Petrel, carrying some of the most advanced deep-sea exploration technology ever deployed, began surveying the area where the Hornet was believed to have gone down. They were using autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sonar that could map the ocean floor at depths where human divers would be crushed instantly. It was tedious work. Hours of surveying, days of data analysis, looking for something that might not even be there. On February 3, 2019, the sonar picked up something massive, sitting on the seafloor at 5,330 meters. The profile matched a Yorktown-class carrier. The size was right, the location was consistent with historical records. But they needed visual confirmation. The ROV descended through nearly 3.5 miles of water, its cameras and lights the only thing preventing complete darkness. When the footage came back, there was no doubt. The USS Hornet, sitting upright on the ocean floor, as if she'd simply settled gently into place. The flight deck was intact. The island structure was recognizable, despite decades of corrosion. And most remarkably, you could still see the details of a ship that had taken catastrophic damage, but maintained its structural integrity all the way to the bottom. The discovery made international headlines. Veterans and families of the crew who'd served aboard the Hornet finally had a location. Naval historians had a new data point in understanding carrier combat, and the underwater footage provided something nobody expected, evidence of just how tough these ships really were. The wreck showed bomb damage, torpedo damage, shell damage, all of it preserved in the cold, still water of the deep Pacific. But what struck investigators was how intact the ship remained. Unlike some wrecks that shatter on impact with the seafloor or break apart during descent, the Hornet went down in one piece. Her keel is straight. Her decks are level. She didn't capsize or disintegrate. She sank like a ship designed to withstand damage, maintaining her form even in death. Specific details visible in the footage tell the story of her final battle. The starboard side shows the torpedo damage that killed her. The flight deck shows bomb craters and the impact points where Japanese aircraft crashed into her. The island structure is damaged but still standing, testament to the strength of the superstructure. But perhaps most poignant are the small details. Aircraft elevators, frozen in various positions. Gun mounts that fired until the ship went down. Equipment scattered on the deck that was abandoned when the crew evacuated. Every detail is a small memorial to the men who fought there, who tried to save their ship, and who finally had to let her go. The discovery also answered questions that had lingered since 1942. Some historians had wondered if the Hornet might have been salvageable, if the decision to scuttle her was premature. The wreck proves that even before the American destroyers fired their 400 shells and 6 torpedoes, the Hornet was mortally wounded. The flooding was too extensive. The damage was too widespread. She might have floated for hours or even days, but she was never going to make it back to port. The USS Hornet is now designated as a war grave under international maritime law. The wreck site is protected. No artifacts can be removed. No unauthorized diving is permitted. The 140 men who died with the ship remain at their duty stations, and they'll stay there. The Hornet has become a permanent memorial at 5,330 meters depth. But the discovery also created a connection between past and present that few shipwrecks achieve. There's another USS Hornet, CV-12, commissioned in 1943, and named to honor the CV-8 that had been lost. The CV-12 served with distinction through the end of World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, and even recovered the Apollo 11 astronauts. She's now a museum ship in Alameda, California. When the CV-8 was found, veterans of the CV-12 gathered to honor the ship that gave their carrier its name and purpose. The discovery also reminds us that these ships were more than just steel and machinery. They were communities. The Hornet had over 2,000 men aboard. They lived together, ate together, fought together. When the ship was evacuated, those men lost their home as much as the Navy lost a carrier. Many of them were reassigned to other ships and kept fighting. Some survived the war, some didn't, but all of them carried memories of the Hornet for the rest of their lives. One survivor, interviewed before he died, described the moment when he looked back from the rescue destroyer and saw the Hornet still floating, still burning, and thought, that ship should be at the bottom already. Why won't she go down? He said it wasn't sadness or relief, just amazement that something so badly damaged could keep floating. And then when he heard, years later, that it took 4 more torpedoes from Japanese destroyers to finally sink her, he just nodded and said, that sounds about right. The Hornet never did anything the easy way. 5,400 meters down in the South Pacific. The USS Hornet continues her eternal patrol. The carrier that bombed Tokyo when everyone said it was impossible. The carrier that was present at Midway, even if she didn't quite shine. The carrier that took more damage than any ship should survive and kept floating out of sheer stubbornness. She earned her place in history not by being perfect, but by refusing to give up, even when giving up was the only logical choice. The Doolittle Raid didn't win the war, but it gave America hope when hope was in short supply. Midway was won by other carriers, but the Hornet was there, and sometimes being present is what matters. And at Santa Cruz, the Hornet absorbed a beating that saved the Enterprise and kept the American carrier force alive long enough to turn the tide in the Pacific. She was the carrier that refused to die, even when dying was inevitable. And now, resting in the darkness where the pressure would crush submarines like soda cans, the Hornet remains as evidence of what American shipbuilding, American damage control, and American determination could achieve when everything was on the line. The last survivor of the USS Hornet's crew died in 2018, 1 year before the wreck was found. He never knew that the ship he'd fought to save had finally been located, that her grave had been marked, that her story could be told with the physical evidence to back it up. But he knew, as all the survivors knew, that the Hornet was special, that she did things that shouldn't have been possible, that she earned her name and her legacy the hard way. And now the ocean has given us back that story, preserved in steel and shadow at a depth where humans have no business looking. The Hornet is down there waiting, still refusing to be forgotten, still teaching us what it means to fight beyond the point where fighting makes sense, still showing us what ships and the men who sailed them could endure when the cause was worth the sacrifice.